Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for participating in today's webinar hosted by the National Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities, a project of Casa, Esperanza that builds bridges and connections among research, practice, and policy to advance effective responses to eliminate domestic violence and to promote healthy relationships within Latino families and communities. My name is Juan Lara Jr., team member of the National Latina Network, and one of your presenters for today's webinar, Enhancing Cultural Responsiveness in the Courts webinar series in partnership with Center for Court Innovation. This is the last webinar in this three-part series on enhancing access to justice by fostering more culturally responsive courts, court staff, and judges. To listen to the previous two webinars, go to nationallatinaNetwork.org, click on the Trainings and Events tab to download the recordings from the Webinar Archive tab. This session, titled Cultural Responsiveness in the Court. For justice systems to be truly just, it must be accessible to all individuals. However, survivor litigants may face challenges when courts are not responsive to their cultural identity. For survivors of gender-based violence, these challenges present additional barriers towards accessing justice and obtaining fair outcomes. Recognizing and respecting individual cultural differences are important to sensitive and effective work with survivors. In addition, differences in concepts of suffering and healing can influence how individuals may experience the effects of gender-based victimization and interactions with the courts. But before we start, I want to review a few housekeeping details. Participants have been automatically placed on mute. As an extra precaution, we ask you also do the same. If you're joining us using an agency phone and have hold music, please be aware it will be heard if you need to put the call on hold. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Ask a Question box, and we will be taking questions throughout the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the National Latina Network website. And after the presentation, we will be sending everyone links to those recordings as well. Any resources mentioned will be sent to participants and receive an evaluation after the webinar. We ask that you please complete the evaluation since this helps in shaping future content for our webinars. So, as part of this webinar series, this is part of a bigger project that is in partnership with Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, UJIMA, and of course for Center for Court Innovation. Along with that, we provide training and technical assistance as part of the project, individualized training requests as well. So if you need any type of similar trainings as we are doing here today, please feel free to reach out to us as well. So along with that, I'd like to pass it over to my co-presenter, Nida.
Sure. So I'm Nida Abbasi. I'm the coordinator at the Center for Court Innovation, recently renamed Gender and Family Justice Team, which provides free training and technical assistance to jurisdictions across the country with support from the DOJ's Office on Violence Against Women, which most of you know as OVW. We work with communities across the country who are interested in creating or expanding their existing civil and criminal legal systems responses to DV, and we host national training programs and webinars, develop online resources, and provide free individualized support through on-site needs assessment, strategic planning, project development, much like all the things our wonderful co-TA providers do. So this training has been a labor of love for everyone involved, especially our colleagues over at Casa, like Juan. And since it's such an important topic and a really significant time to address this topic, we were all very deliberate in the planning process, and we came up with a set of training goals that include enhance the capacity of court staff and judges to identify, develop, and implement culturally responsive practices into their court culture. So essentially, what are things that court staff can do for their own professional development to make sure that everyone coming into the courthouse or whatever agency they work at is treated with equity. Identify role-specific responsibilities in implementing culturally responsive practices in the courts. So ensuring that every staff member understands that they individually impact people's experiences in the court and empowering staff to respond accordingly. And finally, assess culturally specific barriers survivors may face in the criminal and civil legal systems and design strategies for overcoming those challenges, which involves expanding our understanding of culture and how it shapes experiences.
So as part of that, today's, as I read in the brief introduction, today's webinar will just specifically focus on how can we create more culturally responsive systems. And of course, we only have an hour and a half. Usually this training takes about 2 days to do. But just overall learning objectives for this particular conversation, we'll do a brief overview of what culture is, why we need to know and why it matters, define the differences between cultural competency, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility, which I think is the ultimate goal, and it's also a lifelong process to get to the point of cultural humility or humbleness, and also understand one's own identity and how that impacts relationships with others. I always like to tell folks that a lot of times when we go to trainings or conferences and when we have that privilege to do so, a lot of times the content tells us what survivors of different communities need to do to access us, when in fact we should be flipping the script a little bit and really reframing the lens on us as gatekeepers to all these diverse systems of help. In this case, we're talking about the court system and the different components of that and the different representatives of that in these systems of court. And then again, we're all involved in different capacities of that. As I identify primarily as an advocate that has worked with survivors of domestic violence, starting off at crisis centers and now doing national work around these issues. And so what is my interface like with the prosecutor's office, also with law enforcement and anyone that might be interacting with the survivor of gender-based violence, and then how that system responds to them based on how they culturally identify, whether it's based on gender identity, race or ethnic identity, if they speak a different language or they speak with an accent. So all these things come into play. So today's conversation will hopefully talk about those main points around these learning objectives. But before we continue with the conversation, I just want to do a couple of poll questions. So we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible, and going to give folks a couple of seconds to answer the first poll question. Does your jurisdiction or does your court have bicultural or bilingual staff, if you're aware? If you can please answer that question, that would be awesome. So folks are chiming in. Okay. Okay, so it seems like most folks are saying yes. All right. 63% said yes, and 36% said no. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Let's go to the next poll question. Is the court personnel diverse in your community? So we can please pull that poll question up. And again, just take a couple of seconds to answer this poll question. Is the court personnel diverse based on your knowledge? So folks are responding. Okay. I'll give a couple of more seconds, and see folks are also typing in the chat box. Thank you for that. All right. So it says here, kind of an even split, kind of. So 40% of you, or 39% of you said yes. 60% of you said no. And then some folks are writing, my perspective is from a tribal court view. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so the last poll question, is the court accessible to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender survivors? Folks are responding. for a couple of more seconds. Okay. Okay. All right. So thank you for participating. So it says like 80% of you said yes and 23% no. Thank you again for your honesty around that. So yeah, so why ask these questions? I think it's always important just to start off, just to identify where we're at as far as based on your understanding, based on whatever role you play interacting with the court system in your jurisdiction, what is your knowledge around these questions? And again, it really does impact, in my experience, professional experience, it really, representation means a lot, but also representation that is intentional and why you have diverse representation as part of your staff. Whether you're working in a court system or whatever type of system you work in, I think representation is important, and we'll have a little bit more about discussion around that. So, again, thank you for participating in that. And again, if you have any questions throughout this conversation, please feel free to type them in the chat box because we want to make this as conversational as possible because, again, this is a very complex dialogue to have. So examining culture, what is it and how it impacts our work, right? I think that's a very important question to ask. So before we continue the conversation, if people can put in the chat box, what is culture? I always like to start off with that question because we may have different understandings of what is culture and how we define it. So can folks please put in the chat box, what is culture? That's how you define it. And it seems like folks are typing. So folks are saying heritage and the impact it has on daily life. Okay. What else are folks thinking? What is culture? Norms and standards within a particular group of people. Okay. Yes. So Mary, yes. Mary asked if the PowerPoints will be, or the materials will be shared. Yes. After the presentation, we'll be emailing the PowerPoint to all the participants. Thank you for asking that, Mary. A community of shared traditions and beliefs, ways of life, beliefs, multiple layers of identity within the context of oppression. Okay, some of you are getting to the heart of it already. Good. Culture is anything from traditions, language, food, heritage. Okay. So folks are already sharing a lot of the same, defining it kind of similarly in similar ways. Okay. So another question to ask you all. Why do we need to know about culture? So again, if you can please indulge us in putting your responses in the chat box. Why do we need to know about culture? I see folks are typing. To ensure service provision is meaningful and relevant. Okay, that's correct. What else are folks thinking? If the assumption is that we are all alike, you are destined to fail. Oh my gosh. Okay, Mary. Thank you, Mary. You are getting deep in this conversation. Yes. Assumptions are a very dangerous thing that we often have to deal with in our jobs. Okay. What else? Why do we need to know about culture? In order to be trauma-informed and respectful to the folks we serve, correct? To be informed of differences, could be different from ours, right? Okay, so thank you for that. And then one last question, and please continue to respond to the questions that have already been asked. Why does culture matter? Why does culture matter? All right. Some folks have said it is the foundation under which people interact with the world in situations. Victimization can be experienced differently. Yes. Why does culture matter? It affects the way we treat survivors and also one another. Because, again, also realizing that a lot of us may identify from these diverse communities, and how does our own identity kind of impact that interaction when we're doing our advocacy. And again, I'm defining advocacy based on your role that you may have, whether you're an advocate that works directly with survivors or you are representative of the court system in your jurisdiction. Without understanding, acknowledging someone's culture leaves you open to errors that may impact information. That's true. That is correct. An individual's cultural identities affects how they will interact within multiple systems. Yes. And again, reframing that lens on us as the gatekeepers of those services. And again, your statements and your responses that you're sharing, how do you again reflect that back to ourselves as the service providers, as the gatekeepers to all this form of help and information. So again, thank you for sharing your responses with us. And I think, and as you'll notice, the questions that I ask is like, what is culture? Why do we need to know about culture? Why does culture matter? Again, I always like to start off by leveling the definition of the terminology we're using, because we may define it differently. Some of you, as you responded to these questions, kind of answer the question from like what is shared culture, norms, food, language, and so on. Some of you mentioned it's depending on the interactions of oppression. And then also some of you also responded, it can significantly impact how systems engage with survivors of diverse communities, right? And again, always reframing that question to us, how are we answering these questions? How do we define culture? Why do we need to know about culture? And why does culture matter from the reference of the service that I'm providing in my role in this community or in this jurisdiction? And some of you may have seen this before, the cultural iceberg. And again, a lot of times when we start talking about culture, we often stay at this very surface level of the conversation where it's very safe. But again, the whole intention of around this project, around increasing cultural responsiveness, particularly within court systems in different jurisdictions, we really have to push beyond just the surface, defining culture as food, festivals, holidays, music, language, which is all important. But then when we start really delving deeper into the conversation, we start asking the questions around communication styles and rules. As an advocate, having accompanied several survivors to court hearings around orders of protection or divorce cases or child custody issues, we do a lot of court preparation with a survivor to make sure they understand how they can interact or how they will interact with the court system or this system in their jurisdiction, but also understanding different ways of communicating. Every system, every professional system, we have our own language, right? We talk in abbreviations, we talk in, CPS, Child Protective Services. We have our own language, and then within those same systems, we have subsets of professional language that we're communicating with each other. And sometimes we don't understand each other. And then just taking it from a bigger perspective, every jurisdiction may have their own tone as to how they talk to or how they engage or how they communicate with diverse communities in their jurisdictions. Body language, touching, is that permitted or not? Notions of courtesy and manners, leadership, cleanliness, modesty, beauty, all of that. And we also have, just talking about image, we also have these various perceptions or expectations of how people should dress when they go to the courtroom, which there's an expectation. But then some people may not have the funds to dress a certain way, and how do we work around that? Concepts of time, past and future, fairness and justice. Again, when we delve a lot more deeper into being more culturally responsive, what does that mean for diverse communities? I know in my family, just particularly from my perspective, elders carry a lot of weight in the conversation. In some communities, we don't talk about our personal problems outside the community because already of what pre-existing stereotypes may exist of diverse communities or in our communities. Attitudes towards elders and adolescents, again, around age, work, authority, cooperation versus competition, and then approaches to religion, courtship, marriage. Again, how does that all impact? In the last 20 years, we've done a lot more work with faith-based communities around domestic violence or family violence. And what does that look like in those diverse faith communities? And how do they represent that, right? And then for some survivors, that's a very important component of their decision-making process, whether they're going to engage and proceed with an order of protection or file for divorce, and what is the frustration that it causes us as service providers, as folks who are trying to advocate with the with survivors of diverse communities. Because again, we get frustrated and when we don't delve into deeper conversations around defining culture, we assume a lot of things, that they're being uncooperative, they're being a difficult victim, and again, I'm using systems language, when in fact it could be a lot more complex than just someone who's refusing services, who may be not coming to appointments on time. All of these things we have to consider when we delve deeper into conversations around being more culturally responsive. So the next question always to ask is, do I have culture? So do you have culture, and what is it? So if we were in person together, one of the questions I would ask is, how do you identify, right? Again, reframing the lens and putting it on us. What are some of the most important values in your culture and to you personally? What drives you? What creates expectations every day you wake up, whether going to your job or in your personal lives? And how does that influence your social circles? What historical events have shaped your life experiences? Again, when we delve deeper into being more culture responsive, we start looking at historical events that continue to maybe affect diverse communities in our jurisdiction. And we see it every day, I know I experience it. I identify as a Latino male, and the issues around not speaking with an accent now makes me perhaps a potential target for violence. And I've seen the videos on my social feeds and everything, and so now I'm dealing with this hyper awareness around when I speak Spanish in certain communities, certain parts of where I live or not. So again, how do I identify? What is my role, and how do my own personal values influence the work that I do? Because and I have a theory that as long as you're part of U.S. culture, we have all somehow at some level internalized these isms, right? And I'm not exempt of that. I certainly have expressed some level of male privilege in my lifetime, and how that's impacted other folks that don't identify as men or male in my community or diverse communities. So again, looking at all those things that impact us as service providers, as gatekeepers to these services, and how does that influence the work that we do? So got privilege? Yeah, we all do have privilege. We have privilege and we don't have privilege at the same time. And how does that look like, right? And depending where you live, how you identify, your privilege will gain you access to certain things, or it may not. Again, reframing the lens and putting it on us as the service providers or the gatekeepers. If I identify as a heterosexual male, what does that identity, based on that identity, what privileges do I have that will gain me access to certain services and able to help this advocate get and access that service or that jurisdiction or that system? So do we have privilege? Yes. And do we have privilege, and do we not have privilege at the same time? Yes, that's correct. So which brings us to the conversations around cultural competency, and what does that mean? And I have kind of a certain feelings around the word cultural competency. As I mentioned before, a lot of times we go to these trainings that kind of gives us techniques and skills and define certain dynamics of certain forms of gender violence. And some of these trainings focus around cultural competence. But what does that really mean, and what does that imply when we have those workshops or we go to these type of trainings? And a lot of times, cultural competence really just teaches us the differences amongst each other or different groups, right? It is a start to the conversation. It does gives us a kind of a basis to start engaging with each other, and it gives us a baseline of developing certain protocols and policies that may increase access to our systems of help, but just based on differences. It doesn't go beyond that, right? So being cultural competent, and also being cultural competent kind of implies that, for example, you participating in this webinar, it's a form of cultural competency kind of conversation, and it may imply that, oh, I took this webinar, or I took 6 courses around this issue, I'm culturally competent. Well, no, you have certain information, you have a baseline of information, but it's really based on differences, how we're different from each other. Moving beyond that, we go into the next level around cultural responsiveness. Now, what does that look like? What do I mean when I say cultural responsiveness, right? And it starts also not just looking at the differences, but also kind of respecting those differences, right? It also, once we get into the form of cultural responsiveness, you start having a conversation of, oh, we're different, but why are we different? Why does this person react a certain way that I did to a similar situation, or to maybe to a shared event? And what is that all about? And so asking that question, which also being culture responsive also it may indicate that you're eager to learn about those differences, and what does those differences mean for that person who may identify from that community, and myself as well. So looking at those, what cultural responsiveness is. And then moving beyond cultural responsiveness, we've done cultural competency, so we know we're different. We've done cultural responsiveness, so I'm wanting to learn what those differences are and why we react differently, or why we understand differently, or why we communicate differently, or what have you. Cultural humility kind of takes those 2 things and then puts us in a place of understanding that I'm resisting labeling people or categorizing people into certain boxes based on my assumptions of the other, right? And that is a very difficult thing to do, because if you really look at it, all the training that we receive, and certainly speaking as an advocate, if you look at our intake questions, there's always a box to check, which forces us to put people into different categories. And when they don't fit that check box, what happens? We get a little bit confused. They don't fit this category. They don't identify as male or female. They're Latino, but they don't identify as Latino, and so on. And so that creates a little bit of a resistance within ourselves. But when you're culturally humble and start practicing cultural humility, you kind of start resisting those labels or labeling folks, and start asking questions, getting to know the person, maybe creating a system or an intake process where you let the person self-identify. And a lot of folks say, well, that's difficult. It's been done. It can be done. And we don't have the time to go around it with this conversation. But when you start being culturally humble and approaching folks from a place of, I don't understand, I don't get it, but you tell me, and I will try my best to empathize with the conversation or where you're coming from. Again, not ever understanding, because I could never understand another person's situation, but you're willing to understand. You're willing to engage the person from where they're coming from, and not assume anything, and just, okay, basically rejecting or preconceived notions of these assumptions that we have built through our own lives of the other. And again, being culturally humble, it's a lifelong process. Certainly, I've put my foot in my mouth many times. But again, when we start moving from just being culturally competent to being culturally responsive to being culturally humble and how we respond to folks and how we basically engage with each other, that starts to change the perspective of how we see other folks and how we even see ourselves within even our own community. So in what ways is understanding of cultural identity affect our work? So again, this is a part of our interaction. So what do you think, folks? If you can please put in the chat box, in what ways does understanding of cultural identity affect our work? Considering what we've already talked about, how does understanding cultural identity affect the work that we do? From the role that you have, and let's just focus on your role that you have, whether you're an advocate or you work within a certain court system. How does that affect or impact our work? I see folks are putting in writing in the chat box. So folks are saying it opens us to really hearing what our consumers are saying. Okay. How does cultural identity affect our work? Okay, how are we going to approach them, identify the right way to help them? Okay. View someone as not a true victim, and that's always the challenge. Being able to effectively advocate on behalf of victim survivors and their needs while being culturally humble and informed. Okay, yes? So as folks continue to share, so when we start teasing out or really delving into the conversation about being culturally competent, culturally responsive, and culturally humble, and again, reframing, looking ourselves in the mirror when we're doing whatever service or help we're trying to provide is, who are you in this conversation, right? And that's a big question to ask because, again, you know, I, who identify as Latino, does frame the work that I do and how I do my advocacy work. And to some extent, I was, you know, I kind of thought it didn't, but it really does. And who is the person, right? Who is the person in front of you? And also, who are you in this conversation? And how do you see the person as they see you? Because a lot of times there is this power dynamic. And as gatekeepers or as service providers that we're trying to engage with diverse communities. Again, even with our own communities, however you identify yourself as. And how do you see the person as they see you, right? And what is that all about? And how do I deal with that as a person in position of power? And you may think you're not in a position of power, but you are. Because you hold all this information that you can either make it in ways that are easy to be used or engaged by diverse communities, or we stay with the frame of mind of just checking the box. And if they don't fit that category, they're out of luck. What is the context of your work and the principles that guide it? I think for a lot of us who do this work, we're doing this work because and to be quite honest, we were directly or indirectly impacted by some form of violence. In this context, we're talking about either family violence or sexual violence or dating violence or interpersonal violence. And what is the motive of that work? Again, we have to ask that question. And how do all these things come together? And how do we frame ourselves in this conversation in a position of power, as position of gatekeeper? And how do we interact with each other? Again, a lot of times the success of our advocacy is based on collaboration outside of our organizations. It's not just about what the crisis center can provide, but beyond that, right? And we all know that gaining access to those systems is based on our networks that we create throughout the years of doing the work in our various communities. And so when we start having those conversations, we also looked at victimization in a very different way. We start making the connections of how this form of victimization also impacts socially this person or systemically this person, right? We start looking at homelessness, poverty, all these things that are listed there, the impact, and how is it based on the person's identity that either will enhance or diminish that possibility of that impact to that person. And we also know that when we talk about victimization, and that in itself is a form of labeling or category, because we also have to admit to ourselves that when someone needs to gain access to our services, they have to meet the legal definition or the threshold of what is family violence or a victim of family violence or sexual assault. And that in itself, these categories or these labels carry their own stereotypes. And again, the impact of this label of the type of victimization that they may be experiencing or impacted by versus how it interacts with the social impact of that: homelessness, poverty, substance abuse, suicide, incarceration, homicide, making those connections. And I think sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes that we focus just on the dynamic of domestic violence or sexual assault or family violence, and we don't make those connections back to how socially that may impact the person. Again, having more deeper conversations beyond being culturally competent, culturally responsive, and culturally humble when we engage different survivors from diverse communities. And also reminding ourselves that if this survivor or this person who's impacted by this whatever form of gender-based violence that they're experiencing, that they may carry, as we've already mentioned, many layers to their identity, as some of you have mentioned. And then they're also interfacing not only with our system of health, but with diverse systems of health. And in each system, we have our own requirement of what they need to do to access that service. And again, sometimes we forget that, and just using terminology from where I come from, our intake or our service plan overrides everything else. And I have learned as an advocate and trying to advocate with, not for, but with survivors of gender-based violence, is I had to realize that it's not just my service plan that they have to meet, but also these other systems of help that this person needs to be pulled in 10 different or 100 million different directions. And again, depending on what part of their identity comes forward, that does really impact and influence how we provide that service, us as service providers or gatekeepers. So we understand that there's a complexity of culture. Is it going to be strength-based or deficit-based? Right? And when we start being culture responsive, we really start looking at the strengths of the person and the community that they come from. Because a lot of times our services are based on separating the survivor from their communities, and I understand that. Sometimes it has to be done because of safety issues or safety reasons. But we also, if we're being culturally responsive and then also culturally humble, we also understand that diverse communities also provide a lot of strength for the survivor, a lot of source of healing. It may not be something we may understand, but it is strength that comes from that. So we also have to engage those communities on also how do we address gender-based violence, whatever the context may be. Violence and our experience of it is often interlinked with our experience of our culture. Yeah, that is very true. Again, putting myself as the example, as a Latino, in dealing with this having seen a lot of videos around folks being verbally attacked because they speak with an accent or speak other than English, that has a personal effect on me, and I have to acknowledge that. Doesn't mean I can't do my job, but again, that is part of what the work that I have to do on a daily basis. So for some of us who may identify with different communities, we don't have the privilege of just clocking off at 5 o'clock, which of course some of us, that's never true, but you know, leaving the work at the office for some of us is just not a possibility. And then for some of us who do advocacy work in smaller communities, how many times have I heard from my peers where the survivors know where they live, where the advocate lives, and they're knocking at their door, I need your help. So looking at those things. What we believe justice is depends on our culture and our experience. Again, how do we define justice based on our systems of help? And sometimes we also have to understand that our laws are reactive in nature. And so how do we work around laws or policies that are reactive in nature that sometimes kind of just focus at the moment but doesn't see beyond the repercussions or the ripple effect to this individual who may be identifying different than from how I identify. So just looking at the complexity of culture. So now here I pass it on to my colleague Nida.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that, Jose Juan. That was really informative. So moving on to this other piece, we think it's crucial to frame culturally responsive practices as a form of access to justice, which many of you kind of hinted or just said outright in the chat box earlier, so it's nice to know that we're all on the same page. But for those of you who might not be familiar with the concept, access to justice is this idea that all individuals should be able to access the civil and criminal justice systems and obtain fair and just outcomes regardless of socioeconomic status, immigration status, past involvement with the criminal justice system, etc. So courts and court staff can work to improve access to justice for victims and offenders by eliminating those barriers that prevent people from understanding and exercising their legal rights and obtaining the outcomes they seek. And this responsibility also applies to non-court agencies that interact with litigants, such as victim and offender services, health services, child welfare services, etc. So a straightforward example could be language access. If a domestic violence survivor speaks a language not as common in your jurisdiction, they're going to encounter barriers at nearly every point in their journey to safety. They might get confused at security, there might be delays in getting an interpreter, and they can end up feeling unwanted or like a nuisance over and over again. And the same goes for individuals who may have specific religious practices or education levels. They might have a historically complex relationship with the legal system or justice system, et cetera, et cetera. So many people coming into your court or into your agency might be experiencing several layers of culture that your court or agency should be well prepared to address in order to make sure that everyone has the ability to understand and choose the legal recourse that they want and that's available to them. So one element of accessing justice involves the concept of procedural justice, which refers to how litigants, both victims and offenders, are treated in the legal process. So why is this concept important? Basically, there's a body of research that shows that litigants are more likely to comply with court orders and follow the law if they feel like they were treated fairly, even if the final outcome was not in their favor. So that's especially important in domestic violence cases because if offenders feel like they got to say what they wanted to say and were heard in court, they're more likely to follow court orders, which leads to fewer returns to court, reduced dockets, and less strain on court funding and resources, so there's more time to spend with each case. And if victims feel like they were treated fairly and like they were heard, they feel like they can come back to court and that it's always welcome to them, and also they may feel inspired to use other services as well that they might get referred to. So what are the 4 elements of procedural justice? There's voice, which essentially means that litigants can express their views and have others advocate on their behalf, and basically that they have room to talk and speak and have a voice in court during the legal process. And then there's respect. So litigants feel recognized as individuals who are important, whose voices matter. So when I was a practicing attorney doing civil legal aid on these cases, sometimes I could tell that my client or the respondent didn't really know what was going on, and it was just like the attorneys kind of talking to each other and talking to the judge, and sometimes you see other attorneys like shush their client, and then like they would just like never really have a good grasp on what was going on. So it's really important that, and that bleeds into understanding as well, but it's really important that the litigants feel like they're respected even if they're not lawyers. Like they're obviously, it's their case and they should still have a role in it. And then there's neutrality, so all parties have a fair opportunity to present facts, present their side of what happened, and make arguments in court, and not feel like the judge or the attorneys or all the staff are biased towards one party or the other. And finally, understanding, so litigants understand what's going on and what their rights are so that they can make informed decisions, so that they have an understanding of all the different outcomes that could happen from what's going on, and they can choose which one makes most sense to them, which is especially important for victims to feel like they have agency and that they're the ones in control, especially because they likely know what the safest route for them is. And there's also this idea of equal representation wrapped up in procedural justice that refers to the availability of attorneys to represent victim, litigants, and offenders, which contributes to the idea that both parties are being treated fairly. And again, goes back to the likelihood that as long as both parties feel like they were treated fairly, they're more likely to adhere to the court orders, even if it doesn't go the way they want it to. Another concept that relates to enhanced access to justice involves the structure of your court or agency. So upon entering a courthouse, litigants may not know where to go or who to speak with, and so the physical layout and the availability of signs and different resources in the court enables greater access for all litigants and even preserves their safety by directing them on how to navigate the courthouse. And one thing courts can do is engage different community members, especially culturally based services, in planning the building and renovating an old building and enhancing whatever physical space is available, so that they have like all these different voices weighing in when they're actually designing a space or like fixing what's already there, and that way it's more responsive to a greater number of people. And often the first point of access for litigants is the clerk's office, so you can consider the availability of culturally specific resources within the clerk's office. I know at the courthouse I used to practice, and they had like victim services like right next to the clerk, and then they had like referrals to other culturally specific services that they might want to visit with. But if that's not something that's realistic right now, you could simply consider referrals to DV, advocacy, and social service organizations for the survivor, and also for offenders and children, because all that contributes to family safety. And then there's also the issue of accessibility in structures, especially because some courthouses are in old buildings and you can't really, like, you might not be thinking of what changes you can enact. So you can consider if it's located somewhere that's reachable for low income and rural communities, and if like it costs a lot of money to get to the courthouse, then like think of other ways that you can do outreach to communities who might not be able to access. that space, and also think about physical accommodations for people with disabilities and for the elderly, especially considering the vulnerability of those populations. You want to make sure your services are welcoming for everyone. And then finally, ensuring the security in your workplace in terms of training security staff on DV dynamics, which can contribute to a safe and neutral environment for all parties, especially through the separation of petitioners and respondents and whoever is coming to court with them, which can be like a huge issue for safety in these cases. Slide. Okay, so this is the discussion portion, which Jose and Juan has already done a few of these, so we just want you to chime in the chat box. So the first one is, what are some ways in which your court currently implements culturally responsive practices? Some of the things he talked about before were like if you have bilingual staff, and then I talked about making it more accessible, training your staff on DV, language access. We'll give a minute or two for people to respond. Okay, someone mentioned language access and translation services, and a couple of people are still typing. Bilingual signage and court forms and translation services. And Lindsay said we have advocates who speak different languages who can assist victims, as well as a language line. Megan said victim witness safe space, so like a separate space for the petitioner. Just something to point out with language line, we've heard like both good and bad. So I think it's a great service to use when you have to have a language that's just not available for an interpreter. But just keep in mind that like there can be issues with like the technology, and then also whether they're translating like completely accurately in terms of like the legalese terms. So that's just something we've heard. I've never personally experienced any issues with it, but something we've heard from others. And then Erin said access to LGBTQ resources. Okay, so the second question is, what types of changes can your court make to be more friendly towards litigants from different cultures? And then Jose, Juan, if you want to chime in with any examples, feel free, but this could be anywhere from like changing forms or training court staff, including judges, employing more attorneys, anything that could be helpful to litigants from different cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, this could also include hiring folks from different communities as well. Representation, again, is important. making systems a lot more user-friendly as far as folks who may have a disability, maybe using closed-circuit technology for folks who cannot travel outside their home.
Great. So Megan mentioned mandatory cultural responsiveness training to court staff and judges. And Karen said having more diverse court personnel that are reflective of the demographics of the community surrounding court. So you and Jose Juan are thinking the same way, which is great. Nina said, I work in several courthouses where I see staff from the clerk's office try to convince, so quote unquote, convince someone that they speak quote unquote enough English to not need an interpreter. Courts should have more signage and know your rights cards for folks to ensure they know that they have a right to an interpreter. That's a really important point. I think a lot of us have seen that in practice. Nina said not to mention no staff should be doing this. There's a couple of people still typing, so we'll wait a minute. Esmeralda said legal interpreters, professional interpreters, not relying on family members, especially kids, to translate for others. That's also really important. You don't want to subject family members, especially children, to secondary trauma. Megan says in sexual assault trials, attorneys will often have expert witnesses testify about what trauma looks like, / common responses. Could an expert witness testify regarding cultural responses to trauma? I've heard of that happening in a couple of cases. I think, so the one example I saw it happening in, I think the side got like a kind of fake cultural response expert to testify that, like, basically like bad-mouthing the religion's response to DV. So I think courts do allow it, but definitely we want to be careful on who the expert witness is, and then also if the other side is using an expert witness, just to make sure you have some way of like verifying and certifying that they're an expert and not just saying something that could compromise safety further.
And from a systems response, there's probably in the recent years we've done a lot more training with advocates to be quote-unquote expert witness in cases where domestic violence is involved, whether it's a divorce case or a child custody matter. So we're doing, from a systems perspective, we're being more intentional about what is an expert witness, how you need to prepare if you're called as an advocate, because quite often, in my experience, a lot of local jurisdictions may call upon the local crisis centers and request an advocate to testify as an expert witness in the case when there's domestic violence involved.
Thanks, Juan. And then the last question is, how can you begin the process for implementing some of these best practices to make your court more culturally responsive to litigants? So if anyone has ideas about like the first steps you would take to actually implement any of these ideas. There's a couple of people typing, so we'll just wait one more minute.
Nida, just from an advocacy perspective,
Yeah.
certainly if you work at a crisis center and you're hiring bilingual staff, make sure you have people that are both fluid and proficient in another language. And having had this experience working in another organization, we were interviewing to hire bilingual lawyers that spoke Spanish for a legal helpline. I was actually part of the interviewing committee, and I would interview if the lawyer applying for the organization said they spoke Spanish, I would conduct a portion of the interview in Spanish, and you'd be maybe surprised or not surprised to see some of the looks I would get from some of these applicants. So just being intentional about those kind of things in your organizations that you can apply, or if you're able to apply as part of your hiring practices. Again, that's just one example. And we were able to increase our, not by much, but we were able to increase our pool of bilingual Spanish-speaking lawyers to represent some survivors.
Thanks for sharing that, Jose Juan. So Nina says one of the first steps she would take are surveying litigants about their experiences in court and asking them how the court can be more culturally responsive, and then share these recommendations among all court staff, but ultimately have intentional conversations with the folks in power, parentheses judges, to ensure changes are actually implemented, and then continually review practices in court to see if they are actually culturally responsive. So you got a lot of elements in there. You did a victim survey, a litigant survey, and then going to the top of the staff and so that the change could actually be implemented all the way through, and then just continuously reviewing. So that's important, all those elements. Megan says, as advocates, making sure that translators are needed for court, if translators are needed for court, that they are available, ordered on time, and engaging in conversations with court staff judges about access to trainings like this one. So another mention of getting judges and other court staff on board early. Esmeralda says, I think she was responding to Jose Juan, we have staff members who identify as Latinx but are not comfortable speaking Spanish. Supervisory staff tried pushing her to service clients in Spanish. So it's important to realize different levels of language acquisition and that there are different dialects. That's a really important point. So just because you have Spanish fluency on or any language fluency on your resume doesn't necessarily mean that you're prepared to actually interpret. It's a really specific skill that people have. Okay, so we'll move on to strategies that your court or your agency can implement to actually have more culturally responsive practices. And these obviously lead from the last question we had about beginning the process for implementation. So one of the most common questions we get from our TA sites is about getting leadership, namely judges, on board with whatever project that they're trying to implement. So it's really important if you're in a leadership position to emphasize the significance of implementing culturally responsive practices in everyone's individual roles, because it facilitates greater safety for the people coming to court and using your services. So a lot of these bullets on this slide are mainly related to language access, but you can apply the same strategies to other forms of culturally responsive practices, which is essentially familiarizing everyone on the court staff with best practices related to, aside from language access, like accessibility around the courthouse and LGBTQ services, etc., and then holding yourself as well as other staff accountable. So as someone mentioned, like continuously checking in and making sure these practices are actually being implemented. Jose, Juan, do you have anything else to say about judicial leadership?
No, I mean, I think yeah, and then again, it's also a long process to get buy-in from judicial leadership, but I think that's where it starts. And also finding allies at that level who have implemented these changes or who have already started having these conversations, and finding those allies at that level to kind of maybe help engage other judicial leadership as to why this is important. And certainly there are several mentor courts across the country that, are doing amazing things that kind of incorporated these things. So yeah, I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, that's great. And like you were saying, it can be a really long process. Sometimes you have judicial turnover of other staff, and it can be a little bit frustrating if there's like continuous bumps in the road. But something that we've done is try to like connect judges from one site or like court staff from one site to other sites who might have had like a similar process. And it like I know at least for judges, it means a lot if they hear from other judges. They're more likely to listen. So we have, as Jose Juan mentioned, mentor courts, OVW, domestic violence mentor courts that have really excelled in implementing some of these practices, and they're available as a resource to other sites to just talk to and try to see how they might have implemented some of these practices as well. And then the other strategies involve knowing who's in your community. So just getting the court familiar with what culturally, cultural-based organizations are present in your community, culturally specific service providers. You'd be surprised how many times we've like talked to a judge or like other like court administrator, and they don't know that there's like a service provider in their jurisdiction that specifically works with Spanish-speaking clients, or like some religious community, or like different communities that are like most commonly present, or maybe there's even like a small group of them in that community, but they can be a vital resource of support for litigants. And then also elevating these programs, so just bringing them to the table, which goes hand in hand with the other bullet point, just making people aware of their presence and encouraging meaningful partnerships with mainstream organizations. So the more buy-in you have from every stakeholder in your community, the more likelihood that your project is going to be sustainable over time. Creating a welcoming environment. And so just like think about, you could even like try to go through your court as a litigant and think about like all the things that might be intimidating for someone once they come in to do a petition or to just come for a court date, and trying to think of ways to make your courthouse or agency more welcoming. And finally, enhancing your trauma-informed practices. So just really focusing on being victim-centered and not re-traumatizing people. A lot of times people have to like continuously tell at every step of the process, continuously tell what is going on in their DV case to different people, and that can be re-traumatizing. So thinking of ways to avoid that and to create a welcoming and safe environment for everyone that's coming in.
So we have come to the point towards the end of our presentation today. Anyone have any additional questions as to what we talked about, what Nida mentioned, or what I mentioned? And of course, we're always available to provide any training and technical assistance around this issue. Certainly, Center for Court Innovation, they're amazing. or ourselves through this project that we're doing. We are scheduling another training that's happening sometime early spring next year, in addition to these other forms of webinars and other trainings that we can provide for folks who might be interested. So are there any questions as to what was mentioned, or any suggestions or ideas folks might want to share? If not, I want to thank Nida, the Center for Court Innovation, for partnering with us on these series of webinars. And also want to thank you all as well. And also, please keep in mind that certainly didn't want to sound like pointing fingers, but also we also understand this is a very complex conversation that we had here today in an hour and a half, which usually may take a day or two to talk about. But also want to be very clear that, you know, it takes time. It takes time to mobilize communities, to create collaborations, and sometimes you got to work with what you have, and sometimes you have a lot more than you think that you don't. And it's really just about having conversations and talking things through, and who's in your own community that can provide that service or can provide that help, but also making sure that it's equitable as well when we're reaching out to each other. And again, reframing the conversation and putting it on us as service providers, as gatekeepers to these diverse systems of help, whether here we're talking about court systems in your jurisdictions. And you know, you're not alone in this conversation. And again, how do we relate to each other as professionals, as colleagues in this conversation? Because I think at the end of the day, we all want to help people, and I think we all want to create the best outcomes for folks, particularly as safety matters are concerned when you're talking about gender-based violence issues. So again, thank you for your time today. We will be sending copies of their PowerPoint to the participants today. There will also be an evaluation. Please fill that out, because that also helps us in the types of content we could provide in the future to different folks. Nida, anything else you'd like to add at this point?
No, but thank you all for attending, and thank you, Jose Juan, for having me.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and take care of yourself.